Pareto efficiency is supposed to is it refers to that kind of efficiency where there is an increase in the welfare or increase in the utility of individuals without any corresponding reduction in the utility of anybody else. So there is only win-win in a sense. And Calder-Hicks often involves a there is some kind of a trade-off involved, some cost or benefit is involved, where something is Calder-Hicks efficient if theoretically an increase in benefit can compensate anybody who has lost out. That is to say, if the benefit is more than the cost, basically. So, what has this meant? This has meant that in applying a standard of efficiency, the orientation of economic policy makers has largely been that law should step in and governments should intervene only where, at least, they should only think of stepping in where markets have failed. Why? Because generally speaking, neoliberal theory on economics suggests that markets give rise to optimal levels of utility. They give rise to certain levels of efficiency through the operation of market forces. So their suggestion has been it is only when markets are failing that governments should intervene at all, and that is a necessary that's a necessary result if you keep in mind this idea that efficiency is going to be my only normative standard to decide policy making. If you do that, this is the thing that flows from it, right? And so a key policy tool that arises in law and economics is cost benefit analysis, that if the benefits are greater than the costs in any particular tool, any particular legal measure, then that's how you have to go forward with it, right? Seems very intuitive, seems very natural. um, so this was the diagram that I showed yesterday. I pointed to this point K. If you recall, there was a participant in the policy process in X, a participant in the policy process in Y. K is the point. Let's say you're starting at this point, that at K, the level of utility of participant X and participant Y is at a particular area, right? It's at point K. They correspond to each other at point K, and Pareto improvements, the green area where you move away from the origin and nobody really has any reduction in utility, and everybody has, or at least one person has, some increase in utility. Whereas if from K you move into the red area because of your policy measure, then necessarily somebody or other is losing out. There is some or the other reduction in utility. Now this distinction between these two processes of cost benefit versus win-win, this arose as a result of a certain form of thinking that you cannot really trade off people's um, levels of utility, because it is not possible to compare utility of two different people. That is basically the problem of interpersonal comparability of utility. The reason, if you remember from economic theory, why people shifted from cardinal measurement to ordinal measurement of utility. But before I get into that problem of why the Calder-Hicks suggestion is the red suggestion, basically cost benefit, why that theory came out of the Pareto improvement, the win-win theory, I first need to suggest that there is one problem that comes up first, which is that when you are concerned only with these two kinds of changes in utility, these two kinds of improvements, only Pareto improvements or only Calder-Hicks improvements, if that is what your aim is going to be, one of the questions that critics of law and economics pose is how, first of all, did we come to the point of K? This question basically is the question of what really are the starting points, what really stands as a given level of utility before you impose your policy suggestions, before you impose your policy measures. First of all, how did we come to K? And is there anything about how we came to K that should be relevant in our future policy making? What is this question basically? It is basically the question of distribution. It is basically the question of whether or not there has been a fair distribution by the time you came to K, because of which you might suggest that distribution needs to change even when you have some improvement in efficiency. The fact that you were at K and the fact that K may not have been a fair distribution is supposed to be relevant to policy making. So what does this mean? Now in the diagram, it looks like K is giving equal levels of utility to the two participants, but just imagine that it's not that way. Imagine, let's say that K was giving more utility to X, that K was shifted, that our starting point was, our starting point of K was more towards the, let's say towards the right, so as to give more utility to the x-axis participant. If that was so, then the question of there has been some improvement may not strike you as intuitively the only question. The question that economics might suggest is the only policy question. How can we expand the size of the pie? Let's only care about expanding the size of the pie. The distribution, interstate distribution of utility between x and y doesn't really matter. That suggestion starts sounding less intuitive as soon as you realize that k need not have been an equitable starting point to begin with. This is broadly the language that you hear from most theorists who argue about problems of equality and suggest solutions involving redistribution. Their point is that okay, you are trying to create free competition and you're trying to suggest that competition will give rise to greater levels of efficiency, but you're not seeing that people aren't starting from the same fair points in the first place. And this critique became applicable also to these kinds of theoretical constructs like Pareto and Kaldor-Hicks, that you can bring this standard of efficiency, you can bring this normative criterion, but it doesn't really answer all your questions, because you start at a particular point of time, you can't ignore how things have been before that particular point of time came into being. So the suggestion has been that you have to face this problem of starting points. And if you're going to narrowly and exclusively apply only Pareto efficiency or only Kaldor-Hicks efficiency to your policy making, policy measures, then you are likely to give rise to this kind of a systematic distribution of resources in favor of the wealthy. If your standard of policy making is just going to be willingness to pay, for example, what was that? That was one of the points that I was mentioning as previously as wealth maximization. The idea being that law and economics suggests that if you only have to give rise to greater levels of efficiency without being so concerned about distribution, where it is lying, then your main concern should be this: valuable resources in society by law should be placed in the hands of those individuals who value that resource or that thing most. If somebody values something more than somebody else, then that valuable thing should not be in the hands of that other person. It should be in my hands if I value something most. That also suggests why markets are relied upon by economists, because a transaction usually gives rise to that result. If I value something more than somebody else, then that person should be willing to sell it to me. I should be willing to buy it from them. This is challenged when you ask questions about, you might value something more, but you may not be able to afford it, because your existing levels of wealth are relevant in determining what you will be willing to pay. So a willingness to pay criterion is clearly having some issues when it comes to the starting points problem. The next issue that needs to be brought in, I'll just come into that immediately, but I need to point out that economics does have two suggestions that really point out that just because you're talking about efficiency, just because you're talking about utility, that does not mean that values like equality are automatically divorced from economics. Economics has an inbuilt consideration of equality or equity within it. Two simple examples of this are that even if you don't care about distribution of wealth, even if you ignore that question entirely and only talk about expanding the pie, there are still two considerations of equality that are necessarily there. It is not as if economics does not care about equality when it talks about efficiency. What happens when you measure the value of when you compare individuals' preferences with each other, when you look at the content of the preferences, there is no discrimination between preferences per se. One person's preference is treated the same as any other person's preference. There is no suggestion that two different people have necessarily lower levels or lesser ranking of their preferences. uh, Analytically, all preferences are treated the same, they are treated equally, and it is only by aggregating preferences or ranking and ordering preferences in a social welfare function do you arrive at some kind of a social choice or some kind of an aggregate choice. Individuals preferences per se are not discriminated as necessarily being lower ranked. um, that's one way in which equality already is in place. And every theory, every moral theory, every system of thought does have some kind of an equality element. Something or the other is being treated as equal. necessarily because of the definition or because of the way you are defining that property. If you define utility in a particular way, then you treat everybody's utility in the same fashion. You have to be able to generalize it so as to be able to engage in theory at all. The second way in which economics already has an inbuilt tool to ensure that equality is in place is diminishing marginal utility. That's a theory which already suggests that when you're looking at the value of utility that is created according to the amount of a thing that a person already has, amount of a resource that somebody already has, that already economics already suggests that there is a bias in favor of increasing the utility of those individuals who have less of something. So if you remember the theory of diminishing marginal utility, it should be clear that that theory has something to say about a lot of policy measures. It has something to say about a lot of things that governments engage with. That the amount of a thing that any group or any person already has is relevant in determining how much more they should get of it. Somebody who already has a lot of things, a lot of money, for example, will value more money less than somebody who has less money. So these are some inbuilt considerations, but they are nonetheless they are dissatisfactory in arriving at a complete picture of how economics can engage with government questions of governance, with questions of policy making. So a few moments ago, I was talking about how the Calder-Hicks efficiency, this idea of cost-benefit analysis, is differentiated from Pareto improvements, which is a win-win suggestion. I already gave one shortcoming with either of the two, which is the starting points problem and the distribution questions that get raised. Now I want to point out that when people suggest Calder-Hicks efficiency, the cost benefit analysis idea, as an alternative to Pareto efficiency, their idea is their idea is basically that when you are conducting any policy measure, when you are engaging in any policy measure that has more benefit for some participant than the loss for another participant, then effectively the gain in efficiency that is created by changing the possession of a resource or altering the structure of some rights so that somebody gains more of it because they value it more, that can be effectively offset if the value that is created can be used to compensate the person who has lost out, right? So let's say a law says that you shift a particular apple. I'm just saying it as a very abstract example. A law or a legal rule says that you change possession of an apple from somebody who values it at 50 paise to somebody who values it at 1 rupees. Then effectively the Calder-Hicks efficiency that is being achieved by the transfer, that is, the benefit is more than the cost. Somebody is losing out at 50 paise, but somebody is gaining 1 rupees. So that increase can still respect what loss has happened for this person if they compensate them. If 50 paise or something short of 50 paise is given to the person who has lost out entirely on the apple that had to be transferred. So the transfer of the apple, the actual resource, is considered the expansion of the pie. Value has been created in that way because it is moved. Uh, that thing, that resource, has changed hands from somebody who valued it less to somebody who valued it more. Value in society has increased from this transfer, and the distribution of money back is only compensatory. It does not create any new value because the value of money is treated somehow the value of money is treated as the same. So how Calder-Hicks is suggested as a improvement or a supplement on Pareto efficiency is that it is pointed out that you can separate these questions of efficiency and from the questions of equity. This is how law and economics has tried to work things, that we don't need to be so concerned with questions of distribution. We only need to expand on efficiency by changing hands of resources. Allocative efficiency basically needs to be expanded, needs to be improved upon. So I hope I was able to get across how they try to differentiate these two things: the creation of value, the increase of the size of the pie by changing hands of the resource from one person to somebody else who values it more. And they try and separate this question from the question of distribution. Who has what? How are things being allocated? And how much of this do people have in terms of so um, this question of efficiency and equity being separated from each other, this has also given rise to a set of literature where some law and economics scholars, some people, some economists who study legal institutions, they try to argue that the law should not be concerned with questions of distribution. Legal rules should not engage in redistribution. That that legal rules should not be different for people just because you want to redistribute some kind of a resource from one person to the other. It should only be aimed, as I mentioned yesterday and as I reiterated today, at expanding the pie. It should only be aimed at creating greater efficiency. In a sense, it should simulate what markets are doing. What markets are doing is that they're trying to get resources, valuable resources, sparse resources from where they currently lie to the hands of people who would value it more. And by doing so, increase value or create value. So, what law and economics suggests is that you have to simulate what is happening there and do it in the same way through a legal rule as best as possible. So, what law and economics scholars suggest is that even if you expand your even if you expand your normative criterion from efficiency to also include other criterion like equity or equality or distributive justice or fairness in distributions, even then you shouldn't do it through law. Instead, you should do it through a taxation system, because a taxation system, they argue, would be more efficient as a system of redistribution than law. If you redistribute through law, you are also additionally distorting markets. The markets that would be operating in a particular way would be distorted when you differentiate between individuals through legal interventions and government interventions to redistribute. Instead, you can do it through tax, and you would do it in a much more efficient manner. A simple example that they try, an analogy that they try to draw, is that imagine there are two oases in the desert, and both the occupants of both these oases really they really like ice cream. They really need ice cream. Let's say ice cream is a necessity in their lives, in living in those two oases. Now one oasis has more ice cream than the other, and they have to now transport that ice cream from the first oasis A to oasis B. Now you have a choice of sending it through one runner who is slow, who is also kind of lazy, and who's also kind of greedy, and who might eat up the ice cream. The ice cream might melt. Or you could send the ice cream to oasis B by a separate runner who is faster and who has more integrity, and who may not eat up the ice cream on the way. Their argument is that a taxation system is that second runner, the person who will run without eating up the ice cream, the person who will run without letting it melt. So if you have a more efficient way of redistributing, you should choose that over the other. That's what they suggest. This is again a contentious issue. You will find this in the course of today's talk, because the topics that I'll be bringing up will be somewhat uh, separated. They'll be less systematically joined together, but they are all critiques of the existing paradigm of law and economics. And many of them continue to be contentious because economists have things to say back about these suggestions, or lawyers have things to say back, legal theorists. In any case, one suggestion is that it is not really clear whether taxation is necessarily more efficient than law as a system of redistribution. And so some theorists suggest that you have to engage in policy eclecticism, that if you are concerned with redistribution, you should be able to use both of these tools depending on which tool is more efficient when, right? Um, so I will leave that particular question here and move to a further question that is quite pivotal in understanding how the foundational theory that I suggested in Calder-Hicks about how the improvement or the increase of the size of the pie can be used to compensate and therefore offset any concerns about distribution. If you increase the size of the pie, you are able to have that excess capital that you can use to compensate those who might have lost out in whatever measure you engaged in to increase the size of the pie, right? um, that is the basic what, how do you say, normative argument that those who who argue in favor of Calder-Hicks are talking about. And what it relies upon is what I've mentioned here, this idea that the key step when you have to move away from this Pareto efficiency of win-win towards the Calder-Hicks reasoning of uh, cost benefit which can be compensated is that you are parsing or you're separating away these questions of efficiency and equity. You are saying we will expand efficiency as much as we can, and we don't need to be so concerned about equity, because if you have expanded efficiency, then you can offset any problems of equity through compensations, right? So these equity compensations that you are making, however, in a particular unit of measurement, which you are using to explain what you are doing to compensate somebody. You are saying, for example, that I have moved an apple from one particular person to another person through a legal rule, but I can compensate it through money. And you use money to explain both the value of the apple as it existed in its prior possession structure, and you're using it to explain what happens when you compensate the person. And since you're using the same criterion, you're using the same criterion both to talk about the compensation and to talk about how the value of the size of the social pie has increased. Now, the problem with this is that if you define the size of the pie by one unit of measurement, and you define the size and you define compensations by the same unit of measurement, you end up having something like a tautological argument or a circular argument. It ends up becoming, of course, that is what has happened, that you have increased the size of the pie because you have measured it according to the same unit of measurement, which is money. Let me explain this with an example. Let's say that you have, and I'm going to use an example of a transaction here and not one of a policy measure, but I hope that the idea comes across of what happens when you separate questions of equity from questions of efficiency. Okay, let's say that Madhuri has an apple. Madhuri has an apple and she values that apple at 50 paise. On the other hand, Jay does not have an apple and Jay values the apple at 1 rupees. So you have a, let's say an instance of a consensual transfer from Madhuri to Jay. Jay pays 75 paise. It's less than what he values it at. He values it at 1 rupee, and Madhuri values it at 50 paise. So she's also gotten some money. Now, what the theorists who separate equity and efficiency say is that value is being created by one of these transfers, which is the transfer of the apple from Madhuri to Jay, because that transfer, it creates new value where that value did not exist simply by changing the hands of that apple, the possession of that apple. The size of the pie has increased through this measure. On the other hand, the transfer of the money has not created any new value. That is what they try to argue. I know that it's already sounding problematic maybe to some people, but just run through the example so as to see exactly why you can say it's problematic on the question of separating questions of efficiency and equity. Now, let's say you, instead of evaluating the size of the pie according to money, which you were doing in the previous example, in the previous description of this example, you were evaluating the size of the pie according to money. Why? Because when the transfer has happened, I am saying that there has been an increase in the value of the pie, in the size of the pie, because now somebody who valued the apple at 1 rupees has gotten it. So we are measuring this increase of the size of the pie according to money, but instead of, and we are considering the transfer of the money back according to as a question of equity. So we're using both of these measurements, but instead let's evaluate the size of the pie according to apples. Basically, just change the unit of measurement. Instead of evaluating the size of the pie by one measure and then considering this one particular thing to be an equity compensation and one particular thing to be an increase in the size of the pie, you change the unit of measurement, and automatically the thing that you were considering to be an expansion of the social pie becomes a compensation. And the thing that you were considering an equity compensation becomes an expansion of the social pie. Let's say you are measuring this according to apples. Let's say the size of the pie is not according to money, you're measuring according to apples. What you find is that if Madhuri valued the apple at 50 paise, then her marginal rate of substitution was that she would get, for 1 rupee, she would get 2 apples, right? That's her marginal rate of substitution. Uh, so you're now using apples as your unit of measurement of value instead of money. If you do that, what you're finding is that actually the transfer of 75 paise, the money transfer, was worth 3.3 was worth 3/4 of an apple. So the 75 paise that you transferred from Madhuri to Jay, was actually an increase in the value of the social pie. The money transfer increased the value of the social pie. It increased the value of the social pie by three-fourths of an apple. And the transfer of and that same 75 paise that sorry, not Madhuri didn't give it to Jay, Jay gave it to Madhuri. And that same 75 paise was worth 1.5 was worth sorry so it was worth three-fourths of an apple to Jay, and it was worth 1.5 apples. Sorry, 1 second. Pause this. Sorry. I hope I'm sort of getting across this problem. You try and separate efficiency from equity, and you face this problem of the unit of measurement. The size of the pie can be evaluated according to the thing that is being transferred and not according to money, which is the ordinary unit of measurement that economics employs. So the transfer of money instead becomes the thing that expanded the social pie, and not the transfer of the apple. Okay. So this problem of measurement, of course, is taken by lay persons to an even greater extreme. They say there are problems in which there are some values which are basically priceless. They consider certain things to be priceless. Certain kinds of fundamental rights, human rights, they're treated to be priceless. You can't really put a price on it. But you can also reconceive this from an economic angle by simply saying that the cost of measuring it, which is the information costs involved in measuring that thing, is too high. And this can also be used as a way in which to explain how inalienable rights are understood in law through an economic explanation. So you can say that does somebody have the right to sell themselves into slavery in a ordinary market transaction? You might suggest that that is something that can be measured by the market. Can you engage in slavery? Can you sell yourself into slavery? But the price of that, which you impose on yourself, that you decide for yourself, for example, may not be a price that is considered possible to measure through the ordinary market system of demand and supply. An ordinary system of demand and supply may not be able to arrive at a price, fix upon a price which really represents or which really meets the information cost requirement of finding out what that thing is. It might be of infinite value also, that a person should have autonomy over the course of their own life. That might be something that is not possible to evaluate through economic criteria. So these, you might have thought on some occasions, are the limits of a discipline like economics. If you are unable to measure it at all, then that's where economics is just going to stop. But you also should interrogate those kinds of assumptions. Sometimes the fact that something is not capable of being measured is itself a question of economic theory, and you should be able to find out where the borderline is using economic theory as much as you might be able to find out the borderline using other kinds of moral theory. It might be possible through economic analysis to decide where economics should stop and some other discipline might need to step in, right? um a few moments back, I was talking about how the questions of measurement have resulted in uh, considerations that you shouldn't be able to compare two individuals' levels of utility. There are problems of interpersonal comparability of utility. Um, Generally speaking, there is, as you know, an existing body of literature in economics which has long ago moved away from cardinal measurements towards ordinal measurements. And this particular movement has also been reflected in economic policy in a discipline called social choice theory, for example. That's a field of study which, instead of a necessary, doesn't generally do so, but it doesn't always do so, but generally it employs preferences in an ordinal ranking, and it aggregates this ordinal ranking that each individual has in a way that attempts to bring out a social welfare function, or a ranking of preferences that society has, by somehow aggregating the ranking of preferences that individuals have. And when you do this kind of an analysis, it automatically becomes clear that you're opening yourself to the possibility of the real differences that individuals have between each other. And when you do so, you also are more likely to respect certain kinds of preferences that you might have ignored if you were only using utility in a cardinal measure. For example, you might be more likely to permit the incorporation of fairness preferences. Individuals often have preferences for fairness. They often care that things end up in a fair situation in the long term. And these preferences are to be contrasted from a purely self interested model or a self interest model of rational economic behavior. If you have fairness preferences, as is observed in actual reality, in social reality, individuals are willing to take up very heavy costs on themselves so as to be able to punish somebody for something that they have done wrong to them. And the benefit from that punishment is not really to them, it might be to society, but people are willing to bear costs to punish people. Equally willing, people are willing to bear costs to reward people who have done good things, and that reward of to other people may have no benefit to this, to the person who is giving that reward. So these kinds of ideas, this idea that you might also be altruistic in various aspects of your life, is especially salient in various aspects of public law or constitutional law or political behavior. People often suggest that it's actually difficult to deal with certain questions of political behavior using rational economic theory regarding rational behavior. Let me give you a simple example which often gets quoted, and that is the paradox of voting. When you consider an ordinary voter and you ask whether or not that voter on the day, on voting day, according to economic theory, do they have, is it efficient for that voter? Is it going to increase the utility of that voter to go out that day and vote? What ordinary traditional economic theory suggests is that that individual should engage in an operation of calculating expected utility. They should be able to calculate the expected utility of an uncertain result from their voting, right? So they, what they will do is they will take the product of the probability that what action they take is going to give rise to some benefit, the product of that probability with the quantum of the benefit. So let's say if a political party of my choice, if they're coming into power, will mean that I will be better off by 100 rupees, expected utility requires me to multiply that by the probability that my voting, my going out and voting, will give rise to that benefit, that the party will win and that I will get that 100 rupees. And if you think about it, the probability that my one vote is going to give rise to that change is actually very, very low. That probability will only come about if my one if the election was so close that that one vote makes the difference. And the probability that that situation will ever arise is so low that, let's say, you can say 0 point whatever 0.00075, you multiply 0.0075 by rupees 100 and contrast that with the cost that I have to bear if I have to go and vote. I have to get an election card, I have to go on the day, I have to take a day off, and the cost almost necessarily might be higher. So people suggest that there's actually a paradox. People don't think that it's actually going to make a difference when they go and vote. They don't rationally believe that, economically speaking, they're going to vote is going to make a difference. And yet they do it. People still go and vote every time. How do they do it? Why do they do it? What does economics have to say about this? Does it really explain why people vote? And many suggest that this is clear indication that you can't have a rational self-interested theory of economics. You need to believe that there is altruism involved, or alternatively, sociologists suggest that there are various forms of behavior we engage in where the efficiency of the behavior or the effectiveness of the behavior is contingent upon the fact that effectiveness of that behavior is distributed amongst a lot of people. And it is only because a lot of people are doing something that that thing becomes meaningful. If only 5% of individuals voted in elections at all, the idea of elections itself starts becoming less meaningful. And it only becomes meaningful when a lot of people vote. But when a lot of people vote, each individual's choice is less effective. But the social action of voting itself becomes more meaningful. So, this sort of a contrast means that the individual centric behavior that economic theory usually looks at, individual centric approach to looking at economic behavior, may have problems in it, especially in context of politics. So this might also give you a hint about understanding how economic theory and arguments that economists make about how you should make your choices, normative economics, arguments that you should try and maximize profits, arguments that you should try to maximize welfare, even, or you should try to maximize efficiency. All of these arguments don't just correspond with the reality of morality, but they also actually shape your preferences. If you are less likely to be altruistic because you think you should be self-interested operator or self-interested rational human being, then economics isn't just explaining your behavior, it is shaping your behavior. It isn't just a positive science that is looking at your existing preferences and deciding what to do according to those preferences. It is also actually affecting how your preferences are shaped. And this might be a natural result of how economics has taken a grip on um, our minds in today's day and age, is to suggest why altruism isn't theoretically understood in various formal fields of study. So this basically should suggest that fairness preferences need to be incorporated, and people should have fairness preferences, and economic analysis should also take account of fairness preferences. I'll leave aside this question of the capabilities approach. It's the field of study that has been it's the theory that has been developed by Amartya Sen as an alternative to ordinary utilitarianism, and it applies ideas that are slightly different from it. It can be considered an economic theory nonetheless. Its application to legal institutions and public institutions has been rather limited because it's mostly a change in language and it's not yet been developed so as to apply it properly to actual policy measures. But you might be aware that various very simple questions like the shift from the GDP measurement system towards an HDI measurement system have largely been developed as a result of this shift of economic theory towards the capabilities approach. Right now, let me move to this one question about uh, one sort of a simple consideration that those who argue in favor of utilitarianism, that is the moral or political theory that underlies much of economic theory, that is the idea of maximization of welfare or utility, how these considerations of utilitarianism often miss out on some very simple considerations that would alter the way in which economic theory is ordinarily framed, especially in the question of how it deals with legal institutions, laws, legal rules. And that is this question of the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Most utilitarian theories, most economic analyses, because they approach from this idea, which is highly scientific, so to speak, they give a lot of they favor ideas where information is taken in a more precise and granular way. If you have more specific information about particular situations, you are more likely, if you have a mindset that is positivistic and scientific, to opt for that kind of a study or that kind of an analysis. Even when you're giving normative policy suggestions, you are going to do that kind of an analysis. But they also find, utilitarians also find that in various situations, the the utility calculation that you are making when you take a particular action, a specific action on a particular day, that utility calculation may not be the appropriate utility calculation to consider in the first place. In various instances, we find as a part of our social behavior, we find ourselves subject to, or we consider ourselves subject to rules, principles, categorical statements about how we should behave that put categories instead of looking at specific situations. They create categories of situations that these are things I should do and these are things I should not do. And depending on the category employed, the rule captures a lot of situations that otherwise you would have been dealing with as individual acts or actions. A very simple uh, question can be, in various situations, you might think that it is ordinarily possible for you to lie, and you might think that lying is something that you can just decide by using a utilitarian calculation from day to day, from act to act, and from lie to lie. You might think that this is something that needs to be evaluated and calculated according to specific situations. However, if you think that there is some principle, some moral rule, or some constraint on behavior that would be in the form of a principle across situations, then in various instances where you might feel that the utility of lying in this particular situation is high, you might nonetheless feel that I should not engage in it. Why is that? Rule utilitarians, as opposed to act utilitarians, suggest that at a prior point before making some particular action or taking some particular decision, at a prior point when you make a decision that I am going to do future actions according to this particular rule, you are engaging in a particular calculation of utility at that time. And that calculation of utility is also valuable. It also creates value in some way. It creates value in a way that is not possible if you only calculate utility according to individual actions. So you rule utilitarians, they try to justify that greater utility can exist when you adhere to rules. And it's important to consider when it is that rules create greater utility than calculations according to individual actions, right? Let me try and give an example about this. Simple efficiency, the efficiency of generalization is often a simple idea to consider in this kind of a context. uh, I mean, there's all kinds of generalizations that people engage in, whether in academic study or ordinary life, or in various tiny things related to ordinary policy making, or in things that we have in our social systems. Take a simple example: when you stand at a crossroads at a traffic signal, everybody standing at that traffic signal is there for a different reason. Somebody is there because they really need to get somewhere really fast, they're in an urgent hurry. Somebody's there on a leisure drive. Somebody's there on a grocery run. And the levels of utility, or the magnitudes of the preferences involved, the rankings that are there that individuals have, all of these things are so different from each other that it's unclear why we have generalized them all, and we necessarily require them all to stop, and they need to be treated equally by that traffic light, which is giving them all a red light. Okay, why do they all need to be stopped at that point? Why shouldn't one person be allowed to move faster than the other on a traffic light on a road? uh, these kinds of requirements of generalizations largely come from information costs. You can't really know at that point of time when regulating traffic who deserves to move faster than the other, who is really needs to go to an office because they're late for a meeting, and who is there just because they go on a leisure drive. It's not possible to evaluate that. And that's why you have to engage in certain generalizations in life. Certain generalizations, on the other hand, are very problematic. You can generalize according to certain kinds of uh, prejudicial notions about social groups. You might think that certain generalizations are efficient because, in the same way that a traffic light is efficient because it generalizes the kinds of people who stand at a traffic light, you might think it's the same thing. But if there is likelihood that that kind of a generalization of a social group, a prejudicial generalization, happens across history very often, then you might need to have discrimination law that creates a compensatory generalization, which means, for example, that you should not be allowed to discriminate between people according to certain characteristics like race, religion, sex. All of these characteristics are things that people do generalize often on, and they think that they're generalizing in a way that increases efficiency. I mean, there's possible ordinary prejudice involved also, but in various situations, it supposedly is a generalization that increases efficiency. But a compensatory generalization might be necessary to offset that historic overuse of a particular generalization. That's an example of a rule utilitarianism in a way. Now, let me give you another simple example, which will again move towards a legal question. Some of you may be aware of Greek mythology. You might be aware of this individual called Ulysses. He was called Odysseus. Ulysses was this one character in the Trojan War, in the Iliad, and later in the Odyssey. These two Greek, what do you say, epics, Greek poetic epics that were there, stories about the Trojan War and about Ulysses' return back to um, his hometown. So Ulysses was this general in the Trojan army, sorry, not in the Trojan army, in the Greek army. And he was known as being extremely clever, right? He was this person who came up with this idea of a Trojan horse. He was the guy who came up with this idea that you could make a wooden horse. And after the Trojan army, which was invading, sorry, the Greek army, which was invading Troy, after it had been fighting for a long war, he came up with this idea that, okay, let's pretend that we are all leaving, and we will send this horse, this wooden horse, as a gift to the people of Troy. And we'll say, look, we have given up on the war, we're going to leave. Take this Trojan horse and take it as a gift, you have won. But it turns out that there were soldiers inside the Trojan horse, and they jumped out and they captured Troy. That was the story of the Trojan War. And then after that, what happened is that after they had won the Trojan War, these Greek soldiers were returning back to their homelands, and Ulysses was one of these people. And it turns out that in one particular place, Ulysses was crossing the sea in a ship, and he had this particular place where he heard that in one particular area, there are these creatures called sirens. Sirens are half women, half bird creatures. And stories said that these sirens actually sang in such a beautiful way that it was amazing to hear their voices. It was so amazing to hear their voices, in fact, that sailors would be tempted to sail their ships away towards that place where the sirens were singing, and they would end up crashing their ships. I don't know why the sirens were doing this, but they did it anyway. And Ulysses, being the clever person that he was, he decided that he wanted to hear what the sirens were singing, hear how beautiful the songs were, and yet ensure that he wouldn't sink his ship. So, what did he do? He decided that he's going to tie himself to the mast of the ship, and then he's going to have all the people rowing his boat to clog up their ears with wax so they can't hear what the sirens are singing. Eventually, they rowed past the sirens sang, Ulysses heard the beautiful songs, and they didn't sink. What really happened here? What happened here is that Ulysses was aware that at a future point in time, not at that point of time when he was making the decision, he was aware that at a future point of time, he was likely to willingly, consensually, through his own choice, make a decision that would probably give rise to lower levels of utility. It would likely be a decision he would have regretted when it finally happened. It just so happened that he knew from beforehand that that is something that he would do himself. So, because he knew from beforehand that that's something that was going to happen, he constrained himself by tying himself to the mast of the ship. And so, in that way, he was able to get the best of both worlds. He was able to enjoy what was happening, he was able to enjoy the song, and he was able to also ensure that he didn't make that choice, which would be regretted later. And this is also used as you can see from this logo of a journal. The journal is called Constitutional Political Economy. It's basically an idea in which economics studies the constitution. It studies constitutional law and politics. So that's the field of study which is called constitutional political economy. It's also called public choice theory, and their logo is basically Ulysses tied to the mast, because this idea of constraining yourself beforehand, this idea which also echoes what I mentioned about rule utilitarianism, is an idea that also happens to be reflected in constitutionalism. When constitutional law, when we try to understand what it does for us, you'll try and see that it actually places constraints according to time inconsistency. What a particular majority government does at a particular point of time is not entirely up to it. It is also dependent on a choice that is made in the constitution at a constitutional stage. So here, this gentleman named John Elster, who suggested this idea, this is broadly what he was trying to say. I'll leave it up here for you to read. So, as I mentioned, there were a number of market failures that are possible. One of the kinds of market failures that is also talked about is time inconsistency in preferences. You might think that your choice when you're walking by a street, uh, you smell some really nice pastry being baked at a particular baker's, and you walk in and you eat it. And at that point of time, you're supposedly making a free transaction. You are satisfying your preferences. Economic rationality is satisfied according to this choice, in context of this choice. But at the same time, there might be some time inconsistency in this preference. You might find in 1 year, 2 years, that very day, the next day, 2 months later, any point of time, that that choice is something that you regret. It is a choice that you felt you should not have made. And the level of utility that you consider at the aggregate, or the level of utility that you consider at a later point, how do you assess that level of utility against the level of utility that you have at the time that you ate that pastry? How do you compare the two? How do you ensure that the preferences being inconsistent can be explained through economics? These are the things that can also be studied when you try and explain why we have rules and laws in the first place, why we remove from the feasible set of choices certain sets of choices, even if those sets of choices may have been utility expanding or efficiency improving. So, this is nonetheless a form of economic rationality. Right? So, how this gets adapted into constitutional law. I'm explaining this because it is part of that same adaptation, that same evolving standard you can consider from ordinary economics and ordinary utilitarianism towards rule utilitarianism. How this happens is that people think about constitutional law or the evolution of constitutional law as a question of a two-stage game, where you have one stage where the rules of the game are set, and then you have a second stage where within the rules of the game choices are made. That's very much necessary in all fields of life. If you play any game at all, you have to understand that rules get set first, otherwise the game is impossible to play. If you didn't have the game, if you didn't have the rules of the game of football first, and you just let people play however they liked, it wouldn't be possible for you to engage in something like a game of football, which has advantages, watching it and playing it. Those advantages would not be possible to gain in the same way as you would be able to if you didn't constrain the players beforehand with certain rules. And this very possibility that you have to first have a stage in which you set the rules of the game is exactly what happens with politics, because you understand that there are certain problems that could exist if you allow politics to just carry on in a utility maximizing way at the time that it is going on. You have to have a prior stage in which constitutional law sets the rules of the game for politics. You can't violate certain individual rights. You have to engage in democratic politics. You have to ensure that electoral bodies are free. You have to ensure that there are other bodies that can engage in the enforcement of constitutional law, which are basically courts. You might have to decide what units of government exist at different levels, at the state level, at the central level. You might have to determine what the rights are of individual players who are engaged in politics. You might have to regulate political parties, things which don't currently happen in India. And all of these things, they get decided when somebody is engaging in the creation of constitutional law at a stage prior to the actual stage where politics takes place, majoritarian politics takes place. And the suggestion is that this constitutional law is a body of the law that is differentiated from ordinary law. We understand it, at least as legal theorists, often by the fact that changing constitutional law is more costly, or it has to involve more, some more considerations or conditions than ordinary changes of law. And what this largely means in our constitution, for example, is that when you want to amend the Indian constitution, you can't do it with a simple majority of 50% of the parliament. Instead, you need to have a super majority. You need to have the assent of three-fourth or some figure more than just 50%. And you also need to have the assent of the individual states that make up for certain aspects of the constitution, certain provisions of the constitution at least. Basically, what has happened is that there is a higher cost to changing things in the constitution than there are in a in changing an ordinary law or amending an ordinary law. How does this take place? In a simple economic explanation of why we have to have a supermajority is possible to understand um, through this graph. When you are making a collective choice to decide something in the constitution, you might have on the x-axis the number of voters, and on the y-axis the costs that are involved. As you increase the number of voters required to pass some change in the constitution, what basically happens is that your external costs fall. What does that mean? If all the voters that exist in a country, or all the voters on a constituent assembly, or all the voters in parliament, if all the voters are required to assent before some passage of a law is made, basically you require unanimity before any decision is passed, then your external costs are reduced to zero. If everybody is consenting, if everybody is unanimously consenting to a particular change, then nobody is actually being harmed by that choice that everybody is unanimously agreeing to. So external costs fall as the number of voters required for passage increases. But if you increase the number of voters required for passage, your internal costs within that assembly or within that choice making body, that is your choice of engaging in a transaction, the choice of arriving at that decision, the choice of negotiating and bargaining over that decision, those costs rise. And those costs rise to an extent where at one point um, uh, the rate of change at which the increase of internal costs becomes equal to the rate of reduction of external costs with the increase of the number of voters. And where it equalizes, basically your total costs are at a minimum. It's uh, and therefore it's going to likely be a supermajority that will be most efficient for ensuring that certain kinds of external costs, which are especially high, will have to be dealt with. So yeah, that pretty much covers what I had to mention about evolving standards. I understand that this particular discussion today was a little less structured, a little less systematic. And that's because an entire interdisciplinary field like law and economics, while still under challenge, and while many feel that it's easy to explain um, what exactly is the problem with it, it continues to be used. While cost benefit analysis is criticized so much, it continues to be almost inescapable. You'll think about it and you'll find that it's actually very difficult to engage in any policy making without at least incorporating cost benefit analysis as a part of that analysis. And across many discussions about uh, political theory, about governance, about policy questions, you'll find that applying a simplistic economic model, say only looking at efficiency without looking at equity, or looking at equity but only considering certain ways of arriving at equity as being efficient, those can come across as very problematic for people from other disciplines. And it is important for you to understand when engaging with people from other disciplines that these are the reasons why this is happening, because of the values, the normative criterion being employed by economics being too narrow. And you have to realize that economics actually provides for various other criteria which you can employ to expand your normative tool set and engage in policy making. So that's broadly what I hope to get across in the course of this talk. I understand that it's not entirely clear. The examples in this particular session have been more limited, but I wanted to make people aware that these are fields, these are areas, these are avenues by which you can expand the way in which you think about policy making, even with an economic lens, even without abandoning economics and moving entirely into political theory or moving entirely into some other kind of moral theory. So that's it for me right now. I don't have any exercise for this particular session. But if you have questions, I would be very much willing to hear about them. If you're interested in this field, I would be very much willing to share readings about them. And that's pretty much it. Please let me know. Raise your hand if you have any questions, or you can use the chat box. Yes, Sunday evening, the best time, surely. Hello, Manya. Is anybody there?
Yes, sir. We'll just wait for the audience and the attendees to
Okay.
raise their hands, and as soon as they do, we'll allow them to speak. So I request everyone in the meeting who has any question to please raise their hand.
If you would want to, like, there was an exercise at the end of the previous session, uh, which was largely applying the traditional concepts of law and economics to a question of data protection. If you thought about it maybe over the course of last night or today, and you had any views about what you think about data protection, should personal data be your property? Should it be subject to, oh, is that all right? Should personal data be subject to market forces? Should they be capable of being transacted away? Is that something that anybody would like to air some views about? And if not, why would economics suggest that it shouldn't be so? Why should it not be property? Or if you think it should be property, why do you think it should be property? Any ideas would be nice.
So I would like to take a shot at this. I think when we talk about data privacy, we try to kind of walk the line between economics and ethics. So obviously, having data can be really beneficial from an economic point of view. Thing is how you use data to say, let's say, put targeted ads on Instagram, Facebook. But also, we've seen that all of these big companies have come under a lot of scrutiny because of precisely this, right? Because it breaches a line of ethics. So I think, as you said, there's a difference between equity and the size of the pie. So even though having data in your hands could, for at least some people, increase the size of the pie, it really has adverse kind of repercussions from the point of view of equity. So I would say things that are good economically are not always in the favor of the society as a whole. So that's pretty much what I had to say about it.
Right. No, that's absolutely what many people have to argue, that you can't talk about questions like privacy, questions of information privacy, which are often considered as questions of rights, of fundamental human rights. You can't talk about it in terms of economics, in terms of what do you say, efficiency. But would you consider that there is any reason from economics to suggest that individuals should or should not have the right to property in it? Because after all, think about it, we are making a right to property in the matter, which means an individual is getting control over their personal data. So if there was some ethical consideration at play, why shouldn't there be a market for personal data? Why shouldn't people have control over personal data by making it property? The way you sell your car, you should be allowed to sell your data and get compensation for it. Is there what precisely is the ethical reason why we don't do it? And can that ethical reason also have to do with inefficiency? I want to especially stress
So,
that there was
y-
those market failures I mentioned yesterday. If there was one that comes to mind in this, yeah.
yeah, again, I just had something to say there because you said that we could probably trade in our data and make it a commodity and probably sell it. So, what comes to my mind, first of all, is the fact that there are a lot of people out there who actually do not know how to handle their data or probably do not realize how important it is for some sort of organizations, and they'd probably sell anything to get money off of it, and that again breaches ethics here. So if we talk about the most unprivileged sort of section of people who don't have access to basic amenities, they would get into this trap, and these organizations would also sort of focus on these people and monetize off of them. So that is what comes to my mind.
Absolutely. So that's one question that, if you recall, yesterday we listed out certain market failures. I'll list them out again. Okay. Monopolies, public goods, information asymmetry, and I'm forgetting the fourth one, externalities. Yes, externalities, information asymmetry, public goods, and monopolies. These are four standard market failures. Today I brought up time inconsistent preferences, but would you fit this into one of these market failures? I tried and explained yesterday what kinds of market failures, what these market failures mean, and what is the ordinary policy response to these kinds of market failures.
Right.
So
So
again, okay, Matthew, you can go ahead.
no, it's okay, Niyati, it's cool, you can.
All right, okay. So I think when you say that we can treat private information as a good, I think the kind of assumption that we are making here is that I have free will to decide whether or not I want to sell my private information. So over here, I think one of the biggest problems that can arise is that some set of individuals can decide to sell their private information, and that wouldn't paint the holistic or the entire picture, right? So that like if
So
from
that wasn't clear. That would not.
that won't paint the complete picture. Like, let's say out of 100 individuals, only five decide to sell, and then based on those information, other companies or like people are making decisions. That would make decision making ineffective, because we would kind of just be looking at the sample of people who might be selling information for a variety of reasons. And also, from what I can understand, having claim to your private information is also something that comes from a place of privilege. Like, poor people would be more inclined to sell their information because they are in want of money, and that could even deepen their exploitation because people would have really personal information about them. So I think even from an economic standpoint, it isn't the most efficient way to go about things and would result in failures.
Right, that's nice. So we have a nice array of views that have come up. I'll also point out that one of the participants, Harshita, has also suggested that the kind of market failure we're talking about is information asymmetry. So let me just lay it out in that sense. How is this an information asymmetry? How does the fact that it's an information asymmetry result in a market failure? Let's say there was a private market, free market for the purchase and the sale of personal data. Then one of the ways in which the market would fail is that it would become impossible for the buyers and sellers of the data to have the necessary information required to engage in an efficient transaction of that data. For example, I would be, as a person who's selling my personal data, aware of what is the information that I would have. I would be aware of what are the ways in which that personal data could be used by that company to affect me. It could be how it could harm me. There would be various things that I would not be aware as well, but I would be aware about how sensitive that data is to me. For example, my location data. Let's say, as somebody who's sharing my location data to some particular digital company, I arrive at some place to meet somebody involved in politics, some particular politician I'm meeting, and that is data that can be used against me if some political entity wants to suggest that I have ties with that political entity or that political person. And I would want to, for the purposes of ensuring political freedom, want to ensure that that data doesn't go around. So I am aware of that information. The company taking that information from me is not aware of that information. It could take that information, it could then sell that information to somebody else, that this person visited XYZ locations in the course of a day. They could do that, they're not aware of it. On the other hand, if law doesn't require it, I don't know uh, all the information about what that company taking my data is going to do with it. That's basically called purpose specification, what personal data protection law requires, that you have to specify what data you're going to, what purposes you're going to use data for. And that is what companies try to do apparently in their privacy policies, in their privacy notices to you. And in emails, you might sometimes receive that your privacy policy has changed. They try and inform you that this is what we're doing. But neither is that information easy to gauge, and nor is that information even made systematically useful to you, because you don't know who's getting it, you don't know how it's going to affect you. Basically a very intractable information asymmetry exists when it comes to personal data. And this is additionally aggravated by the fact that unlike various other goods that you have, like if I sell my car, the car isn't going to come back and hit me on the head or hurt me in any way. But if I sell my personal data, that personal data is still inextricably connected with my identity. It can still be traced back to me. That's what personal data means. That's the definition of personal data. It can identify that person. That's why it's personal data. So as long as I'm identifiable by it, I can be harmed by it. So that's one suggestion about information asymmetry. Other suggestions, though, as you pointed out, Niyati, there was a problem of what happens if you give complete control over information to an individual. In that sense, you're going to face problems when there are ordinary issues of the aggregation of information for social purposes. When government uses information, it needs that information to be of certain levels of integrity so as to be able to make social choices about certain policies, for example, or companies need to make choices about products. And they can't get that unless they have some level of information about the ways in which preferences differ from each other between individuals. And to have a bad data set is as good as not having any data set at all. It could actually be worse. So in that sense, there's also a social need to have information from people. And what that largely means, though, is that And as you mentioned, there are also equity issues involved. If you make it completely open, what's going to happen to the level of privacy available to different classes of economic classes of individuals? That's clearly an equity issue. So all of these largely have given rise to this suggestion. Since at least 20, 30 years, we have had laws in Europe at least, which are strong privacy laws. And recently they're starting to come up in other countries. India is considering a privacy law on informational privacy now. But the model that ordinarily gets employed is that you ordinarily require that in personal data is transferred on the basis of consent, but you make exceptions to it for certain reasons of social purposes. And those exceptions, designing those exceptions, are particularly important in ensuring that there is a fair allocation of power between individuals. So this is why you can't really say that personal data is or is not property, because just like property, you do have the choice in various situations to decide when that personal data is going to transfer from you to somebody else. But in various situations, you're also not going to have that choice. And this is actually very similar to many resources in the that you have to deal with. For example, it's kind of like you can say that a house is your property, and you can suggest therefore that that's under your control. But the law can require in certain situations that there can be compulsory acquisition of that property, right? So in those situations, the amount of money for which that house is going to transfer from you to the government and then to some other social purpose, social use, is not going to be decided by you. You, unlike with other transfers of property, are not going to be able to decide how much that compulsory acquisition is going to be for. Instead, you're going to get a compensation that is determined by law. That, as I mentioned yesterday, is the definition of a liability rule. A liability rule decides who is going to get a particular valuable thing, and also decides the value at which it is going to transfer. So anything actually is subject not just to property rules. Even if you, as a layperson, consider it as property, house is property, it's not really subject only to property rules. It can sometimes be subject to liability rules. Similarly, data, while you might think in certain situations it's good to think of it as property, as something within your control, it's also not going to be within your control. And it's also going to be good in situations where it is not treated as property, when you treat them as inalienable rights. That was the third category: property, liability, inalienability. So, as it turns out, personal data is actually a hybrid of all three of these rules. All three of these rules are involved in regulating personal data. And all of this is possible to explain through economic theory. It may be actually difficult to explain this variety of rules using any other body of theory, or any other body of social science except economics. So yeah, Maitri, you had something to say?
Yeah, I actually had a question. So, like, I heard you speak in this one question struck my fancy. The fact that consent and choice are different concepts. And over the internet, what happens is even if I have the choice to give away my personal data, sometimes consent takes the form of, I can only retrieve certain information given that, I provide my data. It's sort of necessitated by the service provider. So, and also on the same lines, we had conducted this online survey wherein we had this one question, which asked for what the reasons were wherein the users disclosed their information. And 90% people said that it was because it was necessitated. So how can we possibly explain that?
So this is a very simple question that data protection law had to face very early on: how to ensure that this choice supposedly is free, when very often what happens is that they say you want access to the website, you got to give her data. I'm sorry, you have to press accept. That's the only way you're going to come in. And you'll find that many websites now, they don't really do that in the same way. The reason for that is a legal rule. The legal rule now says that if a company wants to rely on this ground of consent, if they want to justify a transfer of personal data from somebody to them on the ground that it was consensual, they can't do it unless that consent was entirely free, which is to say that you can require that they that that their access to some particular digital service is made conditional on the transfer of personal data only if that transfer of personal data is necessary for giving that service. For example, if a website like Spotify or something like Zomato or something says that I want to give you personalized suggestions regarding what music you should listen to, regarding what food you should buy, or something like that, But to give that information to you, I need to have your personal data. It is only for that service that you can ask for that personal data. Otherwise, if you don't need it, then you can't ask for it as a necessary conditions for access to that data. So it's free access to all of your services which do not require personal data. And if a particular kind of service does require personal data, the law allows that you can ask for that personal data as a condition, because otherwise it's not even possible to give that service, the personalized customized service. So that's the line that the law has tried to draw. It's only consensual when it's only a question of consent where it is non-necessary. So you can still consent to give your personal data for something which is not necessary, but in that case the service should not be conditional on it. It's basically like charity.
Right, I completely understand. Thank you so much.
Does anybody have do you encounter this discipline of law and economics generally at all in any field or any course subject? I don't know. You'll be free to mention from the attendees as well if you have had to encounter this discipline or this interdisciplinary field. The chat is open. See, because many of the things I talked about today as a critique of law and economics, it may not make sense as why am I attacking this kind of proposition when you don't already believe in the proposition, like a Kaldor-Hicks efficiency or a Pareto efficiency. It's only if you see some value in it that you see the critique of it as being somewhat meaningful, which is why I tried to explain yesterday. But yeah, if most people haven't encountered it, then I think one of the things you can take away, the general takeaway can also be that economics isn't a discipline that is constrained by questions of markets. It is easily very much applicable in other fields to explain choices you make in governance, politics, so even in society. So it's a very flexible tool in that sense, and mostly because of that normative criteria it employs. But that also means that in certain situations it goes wrong because of how flexible it is. Okay, I think that's pretty much.
Right. I think if anyone in the audience has any questions, they can raise their hands and we'll take them up. Otherwise, so we could conclude the session if you're okay with that.
That's good, yeah.
Okay, so see, none, I think we'll proceed towards the conclusion. Thank you so much, sir, for the extremely insightful workshop. I think despite your apprehensions, the points that you set out to make really came through. We are grateful to you for taking out the time and gracing our festival. Your observations and innovative parallels that you introduced throughout, especially the one with the Odysseus, introduced us to new and thought-provoking ideas that we'll be mulling over for a long time to come. Once again, thank you so much, sir, for the extremely insightful workshop.
Thank you. It's been entirely my honor. These are things that I'm also trying to study and work on. So you'll be surprised if you ever have the occasion to give a class on something. You'll be surprised how much it helps to have to explain to people. I mean, people have to do it all the time in exams, but yeah, it's nothing like having to talk to a bunch of people about and pretending that you understand all of it properly. In any case, it's been very helpful for me as well. Thanks so much for having me, and it was a huge honor.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone. All the best.
Thank you, sir.
Good night.
Okay. And with that, we come to the end of the festival.